My name is Jin Ho Kim, and although that name has been erased from North Korea's official records, it still carries the story of who I was. I was erased along with my family for committing the most serious crime anyone can commit in our country, believing in something greater than the supreme leader himself. Today at 28, my journey begins long before that, when I was still a boy raised to be the perfect model of the world's most closed regime. I was born in Pyongyang in 1995, in a grey apartment building that stood out like an indelible mark against the capital's cloudy sky. My father, Kim Dong, worked at the Jang steel factory. His hands were always stained with rust and charcoal, as if hard work were his only identity. Every day at 5 a.m. he followed the same ritual. A bow before the portrait of the great leader that hung in our living room, and a whisper of gratitude that he repeated without even thinking, like a mantra. My mother, Park Suni, was a nurse at Pyongyang People's Hospital. Her white coat was always impeccable, but her eyes, though tired, held a quiet determination that I would only understand much later. We lived in a small 2-room apartment on the 7th floor of a building that looked as if it had never seen a ray of direct sunlight. The water only ran for 3 hours a day, and electricity was a gift that depended on the state's mood. But for us this was paradise, or at least that's what we'd been taught to believe. The walls were lined with portraits of the 3 leaders, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un, and their serious gazes were always there, watching our every move. They were protecting us, caring for us, and above all, loving us. Every morning before school, we followed the family ritual. We stood, hands clasped, before the portraits of our leaders and recited the words that had been engraved in our souls since our earliest years. Thank you, great leader, for giving us life. Thank you for protecting us from the evil capitalist world. Those words resounded like an echo, repeated day after day. My younger sister, Min, was only 6 years old, but she already repeated those words with a seriousness that broke my heart. Her wide eyes shone with a blind faith that I also shared. At Kim Il-sung Elementary School in Moranong District, each day began with an ideological indoctrination class. We sat in perfectly aligned rows wearing immaculate blue uniforms, and the teacher, whom we called only Professor Ah, lectured us on the enormity of our system. She spoke of how the rest of the world lived in misery, while we basked in the generosity and paternal love of our leader. Capitalism is a disease, she said firmly, tapping her finger on the world map, always highlighting the United States in red. We, on the other hand, were the only ones truly free. In the afternoons after school, we would gather for group activities, marching through the schoolyard and singing hymns of praise to the regime. Our childish voices rose in unison. The general is our father. The party is our mother. We have nothing to envy in the world. I sang with genuine fervor, believing every word, feeling I was part of something greater, something eternal. On weekends, my family and I would visit Pyongyang's sacred monuments. We would stroll through Kim Il-sung Square, that vast terrace where bronze statues of the leaders stood like benevolent giants. We would bow deeply and place fresh flowers at the feet of these statues, as if they were gods watching over us. It was the world we knew. It was our reality, our truth. And deep down, we believed there was nothing beyond it. Until one day everything changed. The air, always saturated with incense and reverence, mingled with the metallic smell of the industrial city. As a small child, I would climb onto my father's shoulders to get a better look at the bronze statues that dominated the squares, imposing and silent. His strong hands held me, offering a sense of protection as he murmured, "One day, Jinjo, you too will serve your country with honor." Back then, his words were like a sacred oath, and I believed them faithfully, without question. However, beneath that impeccable facade, something was beginning to crack, but I couldn't yet see it. My mother, with her serene and silent gaze, had her own moments of solitude. When she thought no one was watching her, she would gaze out the window with a distant look, lost somewhere far away. Her fingers, almost like a reflex, caressed a scar on her wrist, a mark she never explained. My father, after a particularly difficult day at the factory, would sit at the kitchen table, his gaze lost, as if remembering something that had been taken from him, something he could no longer touch. One of those winter nights, as the biting wind blew through the buildings and the heating failed again, I woke to whispers coming from the kitchen. I got up curious and found my parents silent, talking softly. Their voices were hushed, but their tone sent a chill down my spine. My mother was crying, her sobs muffled against my father's shoulder, and he, in an exhausted tone, repeated over and over, "There's nothing we can do." I didn't understand what they were saying at the time, but that moment was etched in my memory, like a blurred photograph, like a sense that something was very, very wrong. School, on the other hand, told us we were the luckiest kids in the world, that we lived in paradise on earth. But at night, when the sirens wailed and we took refuge in the cold, damp basements during defense drills, I wondered why, if we were in paradise, we had to hide all the time. Food, increasingly scarce, was no longer enough. My sister Min was visibly thinner, and when I asked why, my mother replied, as if offering a hopeless explanation, "It's part of the noble sacrifice for the country." I, as the perfect child of the regime, was raised to love without question, to obey without hesitation, to live and breathe for the glory of the state. But even so, inside me something was beginning to stir. A thirst that the party's words could not quench. A hunger that ideology could not fill. At the time, I didn't know what it was. But in retrospect, I realized it was the first whisper of something that would change my life forever. The change came quietly, shrouded in secrecy and disguised as a family visit. It was the fall of 2010, and I was 15 when my uncle Min Yun came to dinner at our house. He was different from the rest of us, taller, with perfectly tailored suits and a confidence only those close to power could muster. As a party member in the Ministry of Culture, he had access to things and places we could never imagine. That night, while my mother prepared kimchi in the kitchen and my father helped Minji with her homework, my uncle discreetly gestured for me to follow him to the balcony. I, ever obedient, followed him without question, unaware that, at that moment, I began a journey that would change everything I knew and believed. The October air bit at my skin, carrying the smell of burning coal, which hung over Pyongyang like a grey haze, a constant I'd come to consider part of the landscape. The city lights flickered timidly, while other parts remained plunged into darkness. Yet another power outage. Jinho spoke to me quietly, his eyes watchful, scanning the buildings around us with an apprehension I'd never noticed before. "There's something I want to show you, but you have to promise me you'll never ever tell anyone what I'm about to give you." His voice shook in a way that disconcerted me, with a palpable urgency that made my stomach churn. I nodded, not fully grasping the significance of what was about to happen. He pulled a small object from his pocket that gleamed softly in the moonlight. It was a flash drive, the size of my thumb. He held it reverently as if it were a sacred relic, his hands trembling slightly. "This," he whispered, "contains things the government doesn't want us to see. But I think you need to see it. I think you need to know there's something beyond what we've been taught." My heart raced, pounding so hard I could almost hear it in the stillness of the night. "What's this?" I asked, barely above a whisper. It took him a few seconds to answer, but when he did, his tone was filled with deep concern. "Movies," he finally said. "Movies about a man named Jesus." Jesus. That name was forbidden, associated with the imperialists who wanted to destroy the perfection of our regime. It made no sense. But even so, something inside me began to stir. "This is treason," I stammered, feeling the gravity of it. He looked at me seriously, but with a softness in his eyes. "If they find us..." He paused as if words were at a loss. Then he placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Jinjo, I see a hunger in your eyes. A hunger you've carried since you were little. A hunger the party can't satisfy. These films can show you why you're so thirsty." His eyes were watery, but he didn't let a tear fall. "Just promise me one thing," he said gravely. "Be very careful. Very careful." That night, after everyone in the house had fallen asleep, I crawled under the covers. The old laptop my father had bought on the black market hidden in the shadows of my room. My hands trembled as I plugged in the flash drive and waited. The computer screen glowed softly, and soon an image appeared, something completely new to me. He was a man in a white robe, with eyes so full of peace they were almost unreachable. The first film he showed me was called The Passion of the Christ. In the next 3 hours, my life was transformed. I saw a man who didn't seek power, who didn't demand forced worship, who didn't raise himself up as bronze statues. Jesus healed the sick, fed the hungry, and when he was crucified for his teachings, he didn't curse his tormentors. He forgave them. I cried that night silently as tears fell onto the pillow. I processed every image, every word. For the first time in my life, I found something that deeply touched that inexplicable hunger within me. Something that showed me a love never explained in history books or in the words the party taught us. A love that already existed without needing to be earned. A love that for the first time I believed was real. I knew that would change everything, but I couldn't go back. It wasn't worship out of fear, but love out of choice. It wasn't blind obedience, but conscious faith. As the days passed, the nights became my only refuge, a secret sanctuary where finally I could be myself. Each night I watched a different movie. The life of Jesus, the 10 Commandments, the Prince of Egypt. Each story was like a piece of a puzzle that I didn't know I was putting together, but that somehow completed me. Each scene sowed something new in my heart, something I didn't even know was waiting to be cultivated. However, it was one film in particular that changed everything forever. Jesus of Nazareth. When I saw Jesus on the cross bleeding for people who didn't even know him, and heard his words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," something inside me completely broke. It was the purest love I had ever witnessed, unlike anything I had ever known, where love only existed if you were useful, obedient, and unquestioning. The love of the state was conditional, while Jesus' love was immense, unconditional, and limitless. In that moment, something changed forever. I began to pray, my lips moving silently beneath the covers as my family slept, my voice muffled by fear. Jesus, if you really exist, if you really love me, like those movies say, show me, give me peace. It was a dangerous prayer in a land where any prayer not addressed to dead leaders was considered treason. But as the days dragged on, everything around me seemed to distort. At school, when we sang hymns praising the regime, I found myself thinking of the songs praising Jesus I'd heard in movies. During ideological education classes, when Professor R spoke to us about the perfection of our system, Jesus' words about the truth that would set us free echoed in my mind. The contradiction was overwhelming. On the one hand, my entire life, my identity, had been built around devotion to the state, a commitment that could not be questioned. But on the other hand, I had found something my soul recognized as true. It was like living two lives at once. One, as the obedient son of the regime during the day, and another, as the spiritual seeker in the secret nights, when fear and doubt faded. I began to change in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. I no longer sang the patriotic hymns with the same energy. During the morning rituals, before the portraits of the leaders, my words became mechanical, empty, while my heart prayed silently to Jesus. My mother noticed I was different, more thoughtful, quieter. But when she asked me what was wrong, I smiled and said I was growing up. I knew I couldn't tell her. It was safer that way. But the truth inside me grew stronger every day. One night, about a month after receiving the films, I had a dream that changed everything. I dreamed I was on a vast plain, surrounded by thousands of people marching in perfect formation, all toward an abyss. I marched with them, my feet moving automatically, mindlessly, like a part of something larger, something soulless. But then I heard a voice calling my name. I turned and saw Jesus standing by the roadside, his arms outstretched toward me. He looked at me and said, "Come to me. You don't need to march toward destruction. I have life for you." I woke with tears in my eyes, but with an unshakable certainty in my heart. I had found the truth. No matter the cost, no matter the consequences I would face, I knew Jesus was real. He was there, waiting for me, loving me. That night, beneath the blankets that had become my refuge and my sanctuary, I whispered my first prayer of total surrender. "Lord, I give you my life. Do with me what you want. I follow you." And it was at that moment, with certainty in my heart, that the true journey began. I knew that from that moment on, my life would never be the same. The path ahead would be difficult, but there was no longer any doubt. I had found the only truth that mattered. Then I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible tapping on the wall next to my room. The sound was so soft it could have been the wind, but the feeling that something was wrong made me hold my breath. A tapping sound again, louder this time, followed by a muffled sigh. Mr. Park Jung-min was on the other side of the wall. My stomach sank. I knew he was devoted to the party, but at the same time, his obsession with loyalty to the regime made me wonder if he really had the ears I feared. I tried to convince myself that he couldn't have heard, that maybe it was just a coincidence, but it wasn't. I felt as if the air had grown denser, heavier, and I was gasping for breath. I put my headphones back on, trying in vain to hide any trace of movement. My mind was screaming, "You gave yourself away. You were reckless." But there was also a part of me that couldn't turn back. I knew the faith had become too real, something that couldn't be erased. But still, at that moment, I couldn't see a way forward. The knock on the wall repeated, this time firmer, more resolute. I looked out the window at the darkness that still enveloped the city, trying to imagine what would come next. When Mr. Park got up in the early hours of the morning, it was because he was already heading to work at the factory. But this morning was different. The clock read almost 3 a.m. He shouldn't be awake. My chest tightened with each passing second. I stood up trembling, feeling as if the ground would give way beneath my feet. I decided I couldn't wait any longer. When I saw the shadow moving toward my bedroom door, an inexplicable rage washed over me. Anger at myself for having been so weak, for having been so careless. It was as if I were seeing myself from the outside, a foolish child who threw his heart to the wind without thinking of the consequences. But it wasn't just fear that gripped me. There was also an unexpected clarity. Something that had been building in my heart over the weeks. Something that told me, no, I'm not going back. I took a deep breath and with my hands still trembling, walked to the door. The silence was deafening, as if the whole world were waiting for what would come next. When I opened the door, a cold breeze invaded the apartment. But what froze me wasn't the wind. It was Mr. He was there, standing in the doorway of his own apartment. His eyes fixed on me, his expression impassive, as if he already knew what I feared most. He didn't say a word. His eyes were calm, but there was something there, something that seemed to weigh more than simple curiosity. He was assessing me unhurriedly. My body was paralyzed, but my mind was screaming, trying to find a way out, a word, something to save me. But he didn't say anything. He stood there watching me in silence. Then finally he said softly, almost like a whisper, "I heard what you said." My heart stopped for a moment. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run. I wanted him to tell me it was a joke, that he was just trying to scare me. But no, he was serious. The next word he said made the ground shake beneath my feet. "And I already know what you've been looking for." I didn't know how to react. He was waiting for me to say something, but the words seemed absent, as if the truth were overwhelming my mind, leaving no room for anything else. "No need to worry, Jinjo," he continued with impressive calm. "I'm a friend." It was then that I realized that Mr. Park Sung-min, with all his devotion to the party, with all the portraits of its leaders in his apartment, wasn't there to denounce me. He was probably there because there was something in him, a truth he'd long held, something that was quietly approaching everything I was beginning to understand. That moment was the turning point. The faith I had kept secret, the prayer I had whispered in the wee hours was now exposed. But somehow this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. I didn't know how, but in that instant a new certainty formed within me. I was not alone. The sound of the door being forced open reverberated through the apartment like a roar of thunder in the morning silence. Their entry was quick and efficient, as if they already knew exactly what they were looking for. My eyes were fixed on the floor and my heart felt like it was beating out of my chest, but I couldn't move. I was overcome by a feeling of helplessness, as if my body had been paralyzed by terror. The men didn't say a word at first. They stood there motionless, scanning the room with calculating gazes. Min Yi was trembling beside me while my mother looked at my father, who seemed to have lost all trace of his courage. I knew he was trying to process the gravity of the situation, but there was such deep fear in his eyes that it made me realize what was happening here wasn't just a search for prohibited material. It was more than that. One of the agents, the tallest, began moving around the room with precision, examining every corner, touching objects, opening drawers, as if searching for something specific. The tension was palpable. I didn't dare breathe. The fear was so great that I feared even the sound of my own sigh would be enough to give us away. And I knew that deep down, Mr. Park was watching all this, waiting for the results of his work, waiting for the reward for his tip. Finally, the tall man approached my father and said in an impersonal tone, "Do you know the reason for our visit?" My father stood frozen for a moment, unable to respond. The truth is, he knew all too well, but nothing could have prepared him for the consequences of such a grave mistake. Faith, what seemed to be the only thing that still gave my life meaning, was now putting our family at risk. "We're after subversive materials. We know you have something you shouldn't have." The officer's voice was firm, relentless. Those words cut through the air like a sharp blade. The nightmare was becoming real, and the reality of the repression we lived under seemed to finally catch up with us. My father, after a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, raised his head and tried, in a barely audible voice, to answer, "We have nothing. We are loyal to the party, to our supreme leader." The men didn't seem convinced. The silence stretched on for a few more minutes, but then the younger agent approached me and looked me straight in the eye. The weight of his gaze was unbearable. I knew he had heard my prayer. I knew he could smell our transgression, the scent of faith that could not be hidden. "You," he began, his voice low but threatening. "Are you going to tell me where the subversive material is?" I was completely speechless. Min Yi held my hand tightly, her eyes wide with fear, trying to understand what was happening, but I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to hide the truth that burned inside me, like a flame that refused to be extinguished. It was my father who finally stood up and said with almost desperate firmness, "We have nothing. You're making a mistake. We're not traitors." The agent seemed to hesitate for a brief moment, and then his gaze shifted. He glanced at the other man standing next to him, who gave him a barely perceptible nod, and then he spoke icy. "We'll take all of you. No exceptions. No one is free from guilt." Those words came out of his mouth like a death sentence. But before the nightmare could fully materialize, something happened. What seemed like an irremediable doom was interrupted by an unexpected sound. A knock on the door. The youngest agent, who had stared at me moments before, took a step back in surprise, looking at the others. They were so focused on us that they hadn't noticed the arrival of another person. The door was quickly opened, and to our surprise, it was Mr. Park Sung-min. He entered uninvited without a word, but his eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding before him. To my surprise, he made a subtle gesture with his hand, as if to still the movement inside the apartment. There was silence for a moment, as if the whole world was waiting for his decision. "What's going on here?" he asked calmly, but with an intensity that almost seemed menacing. He turned to the officers, his gaze now darker than I'd ever imagined. The agents exchanged quick glances, and then the taller officer responded with a sharpness he wasn't accustomed to displaying. "A loyalty issue, but it's resolved. Don't worry, Sung-min." Sung-min looked directly at him and said, his voice now lower and more decisive, This isn't simple, is it? It involves more than you think. The officers exchanged more glances, but something in Zungmin's posture made them back away. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. I knew he was doing something, but I couldn't understand what exactly. Let's go, the taller officer finally said reluctantly. We don't want any more trouble. And with that, the three men left, as if they'd never been there. They closed the door behind them with a bang that echoed through the house. But even though the tension still lingered, a wave of relief washed over me. Minnie looked at me with confused eyes, not fully understanding what had just happened. My mother, pale-faced, hugged me silently, as if relieved but also lost in thought. My father still stood motionless, unsure of what to say. And it was Mr. Park Zungmin, the man we never imagined capable of anything other than loyalty to the party, who finally broke the silence. You are safe now. But please remember what just happened. What you did here is not something that can be left behind. But for now, go in peace. I looked at her, her eyes heavy with sleep and pain, but also with a despair that tore at me. She looked more fragile than ever, her skin pale and her eyes so wide they seemed to swallow the darkness around us. Minnie clung even tighter to my arm, her fingers pressing hard against my skin as if trying to convince herself that I could protect us all. Jin-ho, she whispered again, her voice trembling. Why is all this happening? What did we do wrong? I wished I could lie to her, give her an answer that would make her pain go away, but the truth was like a stone in the pit of my stomach. Nothing, Minnie, nothing. We didn't do anything wrong, I said, but my voice betrayed me, and it came out more like a sigh than a certainty. She looked at me with a pained expression that made my heart skip a beat. But you know what happened, don't you? You know why we're here. I wanted to deny it, but reality was evident in every detail around us. The violently rocking train, the biting cold seeping through the cracks, the other families huddled together with blank, defeated looks. The answer was right there, right in front of us. Yes, I whispered, trying to remain calm. It was because of me. Because I couldn't hide my faith. Minnie grimaced, as if she didn't quite understand. She was just a child, and the weight of what I'd just confessed hadn't yet sunk in. You were just praying, Jin-ho, she said, the purity in her voice nearly shattering me into 1,000 pieces. What's wrong with that? Why does that make us evil? I sighed and pulled her closer to me, trying to give her some comfort in the chaos we were immersed in. I don't know, Minnie. I really don't know. The train car was unbearably cramped, and the other prisoners around us, many of them older and with faces marked by unimaginable suffering, seemed to accept their fate with apathetic resignation, as if they had long ago lost all hope of freedom. I could hear the muffled whispers of some, murmurs about the regime, about the cruelty of the authorities, but they were merely echoes devoid of any real force. In the opposite corner of the car, my mother remained completely silent. Her eyes were fixed on some distant point, but it seemed she was losing a part of herself there in those endless hours of travel. Her suffering was invisible, but it was there, immense, filling every space between us. My father, on the other hand, remained motionless. His hands were clasped and his body was hunched, as if the burden on his shoulders were too heavy to bear. Yet in his eyes was a flame that had not yet died, a flame of resilience perhaps, or simply the desire to survive and see another day. On the second night, the cold intensified and the train began to rock even more violently. Minnie was already asleep, or at least trying to be, with her head resting on my shoulder. I could feel her calm, soft breathing, a stark contrast to the despair surrounding us. I wondered for a moment what she would think when she learned what was really happening, what had brought us here. I continued to stare around the small space of the train car, trying to keep my mind occupied, to push away the growing terror in my chest. And it was in this tense silence, in the midst of the almost absolute darkness, that I heard a familiar voice, low and trembling. Jin-ho. It was my mother. She had never spoken much during the trip, but now for the first time she seemed to be really looking at me, searching for me. Yes, Mom, I replied, trying not to let my voice sound fragile. She hesitated for a moment, as if the words were stuck in her throat before finally speaking. I feel like we did something wrong. We shouldn't have let you go down this path. I feel like it's my fault. I felt a direct blow to the chest, as if it had been ripped out of me. Her words completely disarmed me. My mother, so strong and protective, was now so broken, so lost in regret. But I knew I couldn't let her get bogged down in that. Mom, no, it's not your fault. I held her hands firmly, trying to give her some strength. You weren't to blame for anything. This isn't about what we did, it's about who we are, about what we believe, and what we believe is never wrong. She looked at me with wet eyes still filled with pain, but there was something else there. Maybe a glimmer of understanding, an acceptance of what we were going through. The car shook again, but this time the sound didn't seem as loud. I was there with my family. Even with everything we had lost and what we still had to face, I knew that love, the love we had for each other, could never be taken from us. In a distant corner among the other prisoners, a man began to sing softly. It wasn't a protest song, but a soft, almost forgotten song, something that still carried with it the echo of something more human, something freer. And for a moment in that cramped, pain-filled space, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to listen. I knew the journey was still long and the price we paid would be heavy, but inside there was a flame no one could extinguish. The routine in the labor camp was relentless torture, a cycle of hunger, exhaustion, and humiliation. Working 12 hours a day, building icy roads, digging trenches, or carrying gigantic boulders made time seem like a straight line of continuous suffering with no end in sight. Each day was a struggle for survival, and hope seemed an ever more distant shadow. But in that constant misery, there was something I still held tightly to, something I could never let go, even when my body screamed and my mind was about to give in. The silent presence of Jesus. I felt more than ever that he was there, in that merciless place where men were stripped of their dignity and identity. Even in the darkest hours, when the cold cut to the bone and physical pain threatened to swallow any vestige of hope, there was something in my heart that refused to give in. Lee Chango, my bunkmate, became a rock for me. His faith was unshakable, and the words of comfort he offered me on the darkest nights were like a balm to my soul. Often he reminded me of Bible passages we had learned during our free time. "Where two or more are gathered in my name, I am present," he would say softly as the guards passed on their rounds, his voice a secret whisper amid the horror. I clung to those words with all my strength. Sometimes when the clang of the other prisoners' chains and shackles rang out across the camp, when their screams echoed into the early morning hours, I remembered I wasn't alone. We were there together, Lee Chango and I, in prayer, and in our hearts the flame of Christ still burned, even though the world around us was shrouded in darkness. Some nights, when silence fell over the camp, Lee Chango and I would gather in a dark corner of the concrete block and, heads bowed, pray together. It was a silent prayer, but no less powerful. Sometimes the words we exchanged seemed to float on the cool night air as if an angel were listening. No matter how difficult it was, faith never left me. There was a quiet strength that emerged in moments when all seemed lost. "Jesus never abandons us, Jinho," Lee Chango said with a sad but firm smile, while his hands trembled, not only from physical weakness, but from the strength of a faith that resisted the icy winds of despair. In the early days, the physical pain was the most acute. The scars on my feet, the cuts on my arms, and the wounds from carrying so much stone and wood were constant reminders of the regime's brutality. But over time, my body grew accustomed to the pain. What didn't adapt was my spirit, and I knew it was my faith that kept me going. The incessant work, exhaustion, hunger, and physical misery were wearing me down, but the hope that freedom still existed somewhere kept me going. There were nights when I could barely sleep, and as the stars shone through the small cracks in the concrete ceiling, I remembered the night I began to pray for courage. Jesus' love, his promise of peace, helped me face the emptiness that expanded within me each day. He wasn't just in heaven, he was there in those small silent prayers, in the shared whispers of faith, in the gestures of compassion among the prisoners. In that place where bodies were trapped but the spirit still yearned for something more. It was in solidarity and faith that I found the strength to carry on. Lee Chango and I began sharing what we knew of the Bible, in fragments we could remember, hiding from the peepholes, but never ceasing to nourish what kept us alive, not our bodies but our souls. And amidst the pain and suffering, I began to understand that freedom didn't come from the absence of chains, but from the power God gave us to carry on, to love and to live, even in hell. I didn't know what would happen to my family, but something inside me already knew. Jesus' love would never be taken from me, and that gave me inexplicable strength. With each new dawn, when the sound of sirens cut through the air, I prayed, knowing I was not alone ever again. Commander Kim was furious. He let out a shout so loud it echoed throughout the camp, and soon other guards approached, running in their heavy boots like a thunderstorm. Before I could pull away from June, a soldier grabbed my arm and pulled me away. The water I had brought to June spilled across the ground, mixing with the dirty earth, as if that act of compassion had been a sin, something unforgivable. I was dragged to the center of the courtyard, where Commander Kim awaited me, his expression even more monstrous than usual. He was enraged, rage etched on his red face. The other prisoners backed away, fearful of the punishment that followed every act of disobedience, especially when it involved a gesture of humanity amidst such inhumanity. "You dare question the laws of the state? You dare behave like a traitor, showing compassion for a criminal?" he growled, slapping his hand into the palm of his other hand as if preparing to attack me. I was shaking, not from fear, but from the shame I felt for having acted as I had. What was happening inside me? How could I act like this in a place where survival depended on indifference, where any act of kindness could be fatal? But even in that moral torture, something inside me remained firm. I knew that what I had done, however dangerous, was right. I couldn't live like others, couldn't become a shadow of myself. The water I gave Untold wasn't just physical help, but a silent resistance, an act of faith that refused to fade, even in the face of the most unbearable cruelty. Commander Kim stepped closer to me, so close I could feel his hot, heavy breath. "You will not be punished for this act alone," he said, his voice colder than ice. "You are going to the Cave of Shadows. There you will learn true loyalty to the state. Perhaps then you will become a man." He gave the order and 2 guards approached me, roughly pushing me toward the building they called the Cave of Shadows. It was a place of punishment, a deep pit where prisoners were thrown to suffer even more, far from everyone's eyes. There was no light, only total darkness. A cramped space where the only company was absolute silence, broken only by the sound of their own suffering. As they dragged me there, my body was weak and bruised, and the night chill began to bite my skin. However, my mind wasn't on my pain or the fear of punishment. It was with Untold, with my mother, my sister, and my father. I remembered Min's face, her eyes filled with suffering and fear. I remembered my mother, her soft voice trying to calm me before we were separated in the field. But what I remembered most was a promise I'd made the night I was separated from my family, when I'd asked God for courage to face whatever lay ahead. "Jesus, be with me." That prayer was all I had now. When I was finally thrown into the cave, the darkness was dense and suffocating. My eyes slowly adjusted to the lack of light, but I couldn't see anything beyond the concrete walls that seemed to squeeze my breath. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to find a comfortable position, but the space was so small that simply moving caused pain. It was a place without promise, without visible hope. But in that moment, something unexpected happened. I felt for a brief moment the presence of something greater than pain or fear, something that enveloped me softly and gently. It was as if in that space of total darkness, the light of Christ was there with me. The warmth of his presence filled my heart with an indescribable peace, something that made me feel that despite being physically alone and surrounded by enemies, I was not truly lost. I closed my eyes, my mind turning away from the cold walls and the oppressive loneliness. Instead, I clung to the memory of an unshakable love, the certainty that no matter how much the world around me wanted to break me, I had something inside that nothing could destroy. In the silence of the Cave of Shadows, I found freedom. The pain of losing everyone around me one by one was almost unbearable. But what destroyed me most was the feeling that perhaps I had caused it all. Guilt ate away at my soul like a slow, relentless poison. If I had never prayed aloud, if I had never surrendered to the faith that consumed me, perhaps my family would still be alive, still together. Even amidst the hell of that place, I wondered if the price of my love for Jesus had been too high, not just for me, but for all those I loved. But it was in this place, in this abyss of pain and loss, that something began to blossom within me. Something that, though small and fragile, could not be extinguished by death, cruelty, or hopelessness. It was a flame of faith, the same one I'd carried since that first moment in my room, whispering a silent prayer, still so young and so naive. In my solitude, with my eyes brimming with tears and my heart aching, I began to realize something that had eluded me for so long. The suffering I was experiencing was not in vain. Every tear, every blow, every death was an opportunity for me to draw closer to Christ. As he himself had said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." He hadn't promised an easy life, but rather his presence in the midst of suffering. And yet, despite it all, he was there, in the darkness, in the suffering, in the abandonment. I knew I was not alone. Even though the bodies of my loved ones were dead, their souls lived on within me, and the faith we shared had not faded. They had been martyred for their faith, but now in place of guilt, there was a flame of love that bound them to me in a way no prison, no labor camp could destroy. The last memory I had of my mother was her gaze, full of forgiveness even in the face of separation, even when I knew death was closer than anyone could imagine. And even in her death, I felt her voice whispering in my heart, "Keep fighting, don't give up." I had to keep going, not for myself, but for them. I didn't know how much longer I could bear the pain of losing everything, but I knew that if there was a purpose, it was to bring to life what they had died to believe. Jesus had not abandoned them. And as unbearable as the pain seemed, this truth was something no one could take away from me. And so, amidst the darkness, I continued to walk. The scars on my body and soul ran deep, but my faith was even deeper. Death was not the end, and I knew that somehow, somewhere, the light would prevail. The escape plan was simple but daring, and danger loomed at every turn. We had to wait for the right moment, when the guards would be distracted enough to allow us to move. However, we knew that if we were caught, the punishment would be fatal, both for us and for other prisoners, who would likely be severely punished as an example. Minseok was a man of actions rather than words. Every time he spoke, his eyes calculated every risk, weighing every possibility. He taught patiently, and his presence gave me a sense of hope I hadn't felt since my first days in the field. But there was a strange tranquility in his eyes, a peace that seemed to come from something deeper than mere survival. He believed there was something beyond that camp, something greater that awaited us. When he spoke of the possibility of escaping to China, a new goal formed in my mind, something I had never imagined: freedom. "Do you know what it means to live without fear?" he asked one night as the stars shone brightly above us. "Out there in China, you may fear the police, the famine, but at least you have the chance to choose your fight. Here, in the countryside, they want you to die without a fight, without hope. They want to kill your soul before your body." Min Seok's words began to make sense. For him, living in fear was a form of acceptance of oppression. But running away? Running away was an act of resistance. Even if it meant death, at least it would be a death in freedom. Escape was our last chance to live with dignity, to keep our hearts alive. As the days passed, the plan took shape. There was a stretch of about 5 kilometers between the camp and the border with China, where constant patrols of soldiers posed the greatest threat. But we knew that if we could reach the most isolated spot where the terrain was mountainous and rugged, patrols would be less frequent. Crossing the border would be the biggest obstacle, but Min Seok had contacts there, people who could help us. There was something visceral in the way he spoke about freedom. It was more than a physical escape. He believed that true freedom began within us, in the courage to believe that life still had a purpose, even after so much suffering. And he saw this in me. When he looked into my eyes for the first time and asked if I still believed in anything, I knew his faith came not from a distant God, but from the strength of his own will to resist. "We have to be quick," Min Seok whispered the night before their escape. "The moment will come sooner than we think. Stay calm, follow my instructions, and don't get distracted. If anything goes wrong, we'll split up. Don't try to help us, just escape." His words echoed in my mind as I prepared myself. The next day, right after lunch, the opportunity arose. An unexpected commotion among the guards, some excuse to divert their attention. Min Seok gave a discreet signal, and I knew it was time. We ran through the shadows, our hearts pounding wildly, our quick footsteps echoing against the icy nightstones. The distance seemed endless, the frigid air biting into our skin, but adrenaline drove us forward. The fear of being caught, of being captured and killed, only made the race more urgent. Finally, we reached the borderline, where snow-capped mountains obscured any trace of our movement. We knew that at that moment, the chances of being seen were slim to none, but the tension was in the air. Freedom was so close, yet at the same time it seemed impossible to reach. Min Seok was the first to advance across the rocks, his figure blending into the darkness of the night. I followed him, my heart pounding as the sounds of the patrol faded, but the pressure on us never eased. With each step, with each rock we climbed, the promise of a life without shackles seemed more tangible. I knew the leak was just the beginning. The real battle still lay ahead, the fight for survival in a place where we weren't welcome, where no one cared if we were human or not. But in my soul, something had shifted. I knew that freedom, even temporary, was worth the sacrifice. And as we climbed the mountains in the silence broken only by the sound of snow crunching under our feet, I whispered to myself with renewed conviction, "Jesus, my life is yours." I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months I felt a wave of hope wash over me. Life was still worth living. The scene was simultaneously terrifying and beautiful. The Yalu River, in all its icy vastness, seemed more like a wall of ice than a possible path to freedom. The surface, covered in a thick layer of ice, reflected the faint light of dawn, but there was something about the way the ice creaked beneath our feet that made me tense. Every step we took on those frozen waters could be our last. A fracture in the surface, a cry of warning, and our entire escape would turn into an irreversible nightmare. Min Seok, however, seemed unfazed. He gazed at the river with a calm that belied the desperate situation. "It'll be dangerous," he said quietly, "but if the ice holds, we can cross. If it breaks, we need to run to the nearest shore and seek shelter before they find us." The river was utterly silent except for the echoes of our breathing and the sound of our slow measured steps. Each step we took on the ice was like a silent promise that if we could cross, everything we had endured thus far would not have been in vain. "Do you think we can do it?" I asked, the question coming out as a whisper that faded into the cold air. "Yes," Min Seok replied without hesitation. "You're still alive, aren't you? Then the fight isn't over. We won't let a piece of ice stop us." The first few meters were the hardest. The ice creaked with every step as if it were about to break. I felt the weight of my own weakness, but Min Seok continued to support me. With each step we took, I felt the ice beneath us as an imminent threat, but at the same time a promise of freedom. We had to believe more than ever that survival depended on our faith, not just in our strength, but in the belief that something greater was guiding us. Min Seok was right about one thing. We couldn't stop. The hours passed like a blur. The biting wind and extreme fatigue made time seem relative. When we finally sighted the other shore, something inside me broke, not with despair, but with an emotion I hadn't known still existed: hope. We still had the river before us, with a vast distance between where we were and what could be our salvation. Each step seemed slower, but the thought of seeing the mainland of China, of finally standing on ground where the currents of oppression could not reach us, gave us the strength to keep going. But as we approached the shore, the sound of helicopters began to pierce the air again. The distant roar grew closer. Panic began to grip me, and I knew that if we didn't hurry, we'd be discovered before we could reach the other side. Min-seok noticed the change in my gaze and signaled for me to speed up. "Come on, don't stop now," he shouted, his voice cutting through the wind. I didn't know if he was talking to me or himself, but the fear that had previously gripped me was replaced by a primal impulse. We couldn't stop. Not now. We ran, or as fast as we could, on the unstable ice, knowing that any mistake could mean a fatal fall. Every movement was a bet against death. The sound of the helicopters grew louder, closer. Min-seok, with his experience, kept calm and guided us, pointing out the safest spots on the river where the ice seemed thickest. But then, the ice beneath my feet cracked. The sound was like a crack of thunder, and before I could do anything, my leg sank in up to my thigh. The biting cold invaded my flesh, and excruciating pain shot up my spine. I tried to pull my leg out, but the ice was cracking. I felt the fall imminent. Min-seok was at my side in an instant, grabbing my arm tightly, pulling me with all his strength. "No," he yelled, pulling me to the firmer edge of the river. "Get up, Kim Jin-ho, don't give up." With a last-ditch effort, I managed to pull my leg free of the broken ice, but fear and cold began to overwhelm me. My body was exhausted and my mind was on the verge of giving in to pain and despair. "You're not going to die here, you're not," Min-seok said, with a firmness that was mixed with a touch of mercy. "You're closer to freedom than you've ever been." As much as I wanted to give up, Min-seok's words and the knowledge that freedom was there just a few feet away gave me the strength to keep going. I didn't know if I could take another step, but what I did know was that if I stopped, I'd never know what might have happened. Together, with Min-seok helping me, we managed to reach the opposite shore. The smell of the earth, the sound of the wind cutting through the trees, the feel of solid ground beneath my feet, all of it made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. Min-seok's separation was a harder blow than I imagined. After months together, fighting side by side for survival, he became like a brother. But in China, there was no room for friendship among refugees. The search for freedom was solitary. He disappeared into the mass of strangers, and their fates diverged. The first time I breathed Chinese air after crossing the Yalu River, I felt a mixture of relief and confusion. Freedom seemed fleeting, like a perfume vanishing in the wind, and China, with its vastness and unforgiving rules, was not a haven but a refugee camp masquerading as a promised land. Freedom was within reach, but the shadows of persecution were always looming. The days in China were difficult. Life as a North Korean refugee was a tightrope walk, living under the constant threat of deportation back to the hell we had fled. During those weeks in hiding, I lived in constant fear. I slept with one eye open, worried that the Chinese police or North Korean embassy agents would knock on the door. But there was something else. With each passing day, I felt further from who I was before. I was forced to leave behind my identity, my culture, and even my language. I had to transform into something I wasn't. A ghost, a shadow. But there was a flame within me, a flame that Min-seok helped keep alight. He had taught me that even in the darkest places, the light of Christ could still shine. Faith became my only anchor. When I finally made it across Mongolia, the freezing desert leaving me exhausted and drained of strength, I knew that every step I took brought me closer to true freedom. I was physically weaker, thinner, my body already tired, but my spirit seemed to grow stronger with every mile. I had never experienced such profound loneliness. Yet at the same time, I had never felt God's presence so close. I arrived in South Korea on a reconnaissance flight, feeling immensely disoriented. When I first set foot on South Korean soil, there was no grand celebration, no round of applause. What I felt was just profound exhaustion and a sense of being in the right place, yet so far from home. Now I was a free man, but freedom wasn't the answer I'd hoped for. In Seoul, freedom tasted bittersweet, like being a refugee, someone marked by invisible scars. South Korean society, with its modernity and prosperity, seemed far removed from the reality I'd known. I was welcomed by support groups, but the emptiness was still there, in my heart, a constant reminder of what I'd lost. The bustling streets of Seoul, with their gleaming skyscrapers and busy avenues, were almost unrecognizable to me. The city, with all its richness, felt like a science fiction world where I was an outsider. Loneliness was now the price of my freedom, and I had to learn to live with it. But there was still something precious that no one could take away from me. My faith. I knew that the God who had guided me through the darkness of the labor camp, who had given me the strength to cross the ice of the Yalu River, would not abandon me now. And the faith Minseok had planted in my heart, that irrepressible hope, kept me going. The path to true freedom lay not just within South Korea's borders, but within me. My journey to rebuild a life away from pain, away from the memories of the people I'd lost, would be a long one. But now, I knew I had something more powerful than the pain of loss, the promise of redemption, the certainty that one day beside God I would find peace and belonging again. As I walked the streets of South Korea, the weight of the past still on my shoulders, I whispered to myself, Jesus, my life is yours. True freedom was not a place or a nation, but a personal relationship with the one who gave me the strength to endure the impossible. And with that, I knew that despite all I had lost, something deeper was being restored within me. A redeemed soul, a new lease on life. The apartment in Seoul was the first place I truly considered my own since leaving North Korea. A small, simple space, but with a real roof, walls uncracked by suffering, and a window overlooking the busy city streets. Seoul was a collage of lights, sounds, and constant movement. Yet I couldn't see myself there. The streets, the people, everything seemed so distant, so unrecognizable. Although I had the freedom to walk the streets without the constant fear of arrest or surveillance, something tormented me. Loneliness. I was surrounded by millions of people, yet I still felt trapped in an invisible prison, one that couldn't be solved with new clothes or food. Physical freedom was granted, but the emotional and psychological toll was high. In my new life, there were days when the pain of the past mixed with the confusion of the present. As someone who hadn't experienced the luxuries of modern life, not even the concept of vacation or leisure, I found myself lost in a society that seemed to be in a constant race. I didn't know how to make friends, how to trust people, and most of all, I didn't know how to live a normal life after so much pain and loss. But Brother Lee was still there for me. He came to my apartment often, always bringing something of comfort, a word of wisdom, a Bible verse, or simply a quiet presence. Loneliness is not something we can cure on our own, he would tell me. God offers us the companionship of others even when we feel alone. His quiet, wise voice became a beacon in the midst of my inner storm. He explained to me that true freedom was much more than political or social status. It's an inner freedom, a peace that comes from the heart, even when the world around you is in chaos. This seemed impossible to achieve in my condition, but over time I began to realize he was right. I began to integrate slowly, one step at a time. The language was still a barrier, but I began studying Korean, enrolled in refugee adaptation classes, and increasingly exposed myself to a life that seemed parallel to my own, yet still strange. I tried to find a job, something simple, a place where I could start over. I, who had dug coal tunnels deep into the mine, was now learning office work, typing on a computer, something that felt almost surreal. Still, my faith remained my lifeblood. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but I knew I would no longer be the same man who arrived at Hanawon in 2012. The wounds were still there, visible and invisible, but there was a confidence that had been forged, not only in my survival, but also in what my survival meant, a testament to faith, to resilience, and ultimately, to hope. In 2014, I was finally able to send a message to the few friends who had survived North Korea, those who, like me, had escaped and found a new beginning. Among them was Minseok. He had reached the United States as planned and was trying to help other refugees. He and I exchanged short but powerful messages, always with words of encouragement. It was as if, despite the distance, we were still united in faith, in the memory of all we had lost, but also in the power of all we could still achieve. Life began to stabilize, but the longing never completely disappeared. The weight of the loss of my parents, Min and Chango, always lingered with me, like a silent shadow that in moments of stillness emerged and reminded me of everything that had been ripped from me. But I no longer saw them as ghosts haunting me. Over time, they became inspiring figures, reminders of who I was before the storm and what I had become after it. Even today, when I walk through Seoul's parks or busy streets, I feel like I'm in two worlds at once. The man I am now and the man I was before all the pain, loss, and struggle. But the biggest difference between them is that the man I am now, even with all his scars, carries something deeper, the freedom of the soul. In my heart, I know that one day, with God at my side, I will see my family again. And all the moments of suffering, loss, and struggle will have been just part of a larger journey. A journey that, though marked by pain, was also marked by grace. And, as difficult as it was, it brought me here, where I can breathe, live, and finally, be free. That young student, with her tearful eyes and a pain I recognized, was just one of the many lives I saw touched by this story. Every time someone finds a glimmer of light in my words, I feel that the suffering of my loved ones was not in vain. And perhaps in the end, this was the only way to make sense of the pain I carried. Their sacrifice was not a mistake. It is now a seed that sprouts, spreading what they believed in even without knowing it. My faith, forged in the fire of torture and loss, is now a beacon of hope for others, even if in pieces. In the deepest moments of my loneliness in Seoul, where physical freedom haunted me with its silence and emptiness, Brother Lee said something to me that I will never forget. Your true freedom is not in the bright streets of Seoul, but in what you choose to do with the pain you carry. That is what God wants from you now. And little by little, I began to understand what he meant. Today, 5 years after crossing the Yalu, every word I share, every story I tell, every tear that still flows is an act of worship. Because deep down, I know that somehow God used my life to give voice to those who were silenced. The truth I carry is not just mine, but that of all who died without ever being able to speak. And although the pain and memories still scar me, I have found a purpose deeper than I ever imagined, to give meaning to loss and to let the light of Christ shine through the shadows the regime tried to create. My freedom isn't just about being physically free. It's about freeing others with the truth I've been given. And as I continue speaking, following the path God has prepared for me, every tear, every pain, every scar becomes part of my testimony, a response to forced silence, a victory over darkness. Because yes, Jesus saved me in North Korea. And now, with this freedom I've been given, my mission is to continue being the voice of those who can no longer speak until the truth of his light shines upon all nations.